It only took 37 seconds. On live national TV, J.D. Vance tried to silence Ibrahim Traoré in front of millions. But what she said next didn't just stop the room, it made America question itself. Why is it that when a black woman speaks truth to power, she's labeled a threat? The room was colder than it should have been, not because of the grand marble floors or the steel gray air conditioning that pumped through the halls of American power like veins in a tired empire, but because of something deeper, heavier, more ancient. The silence. It wasn't just any silence. It was the silence that comes right before someone is cast out, not with fire, but with rules, with paragraphs and protocols and nods from men who'd mastered the art of destruction through formality. At the center of it all stood a woman with eyes darker than the ink of the Constitution, a woman who didn't blink, Ibrahim Traoré. She stood tall, not in defiance, but in truth, the kind of truth that makes powerful people very uncomfortable. Her hair was wrapped in a deep indigo scarf, the kind worn by griots and revolutionaries, her jacket threadbare, but ironed, her hands resting on the polished wood of the witness stand as though she were steadying the very country that had just tried to erase her. Across from her, the senators sat like frozen kings in an ancient court. Cameras rolled. The entire nation was watching, and yet no one spoke, until he did. J.D. Vance leaned forward, adjusted his tie like a wolf brushing off dirt, and let the words fall from his lips with practiced elegance. "Miss Traoré, you don't belong here." A few gasps, a cough. A reporter's pen stopped scribbling mid-sentence. But Traoré didn't flinch. She simply looked at him, the corners of her mouth not smiling, but aware. Like she'd heard this line before in different languages, from different uniforms across different continents. Then came the phrase that changed everything. "Your presence here," said Senator Dalrymple, one of Vance's loyalists, "constitutes a national security threat under Clause 14.7 of the Homeland Safety Reinstatement Act, a law passed in haste, buried in pages no one read, designed for someone exactly like her." It was happening. They were voting to deport her, not for a crime, not for violence, but because she had testified about corruption in federal police units, because she dared to speak the words reparations, land equity, and military divestment all in one sentence during a national broadcast, because she had grown too loud, too beloved, too dangerous. Senator Garcia tried to intervene. "She's an American resident, a former Marine intelligence analyst. She saved more American lives overseas than half this committee combined." "This isn't about her past, J.D.," Vance interrupted smoothly. "It's about the future she's trying to create, a future some of us aren't ready for." The statement echoed like a quiet threat disguised as wisdom. Traoré turned toward the crowd. Behind the barricades in the gallery sat a sea of faces: black-brown veterans, nurses, teachers, farm workers, janitors, people who had flown in from Ohio, Georgia, South Dakota, just to sit behind her in solidarity. She took one breath, then said calmly, "I don't belong here. I was born in a hospital run by American aid, educated in your schools, bled in your wars, paid taxes I didn't owe for streets I wasn't allowed to walk safely on. And when I built a school in Baltimore for the children, your system forgot I wasn't asking to belong. I was belonging." The room didn't clap, but it shifted. Something in the air cracked, like truth had been spoken in a place designed to muffle it. J.D. Vance stood, his face unreadable. The vote was called. The tally appeared on the screens behind them. Yes, 47, nays 43. She was officially expelled. A woman with no felonies, no treason, no violence, just a voice. The guards stepped forward not to cuff her, but to escort her. That was the cruel elegance of it. As she walked out of the chamber, slowly, silently, a small girl in the gallery slipped her a folded note under the rail. No older than 10, with braids and a trembling lip. Traoré took it, pocketed it, and nodded once to her, to the room, to history. Outside, cameras exploded in white flashes. Protesters screamed. Someone threw a single red rose on the steps as she passed. No one knew where she was going next. But the question that lingered wasn't where she would go. It was, what happens to a country that silences its prophets before they finish speaking? And so the silence followed her, not as punishment, but as prophecy. The crowd at JFK wasn't a mob. It was a heartbreak with a pulse. Dozens had gathered behind barricades, their signs handwritten, their voices raw from shouting since dawn. Some came with roses, others with signs that read, "She speaks for us, born here or not, she is ours and let her stay." The wind tugged at their jackets, but they held their ground. Teachers, nurses, sanitation workers, war veterans, grandmothers with walkers, even a former senator in a wheelchair. Inside, Traoré walked through Terminal 4, flanked by federal officers who never made eye contact, who seemed almost ashamed of the badge they wore that day. Her departure wasn't hidden, but it wasn't publicized either. It was meant to happen quietly, like some state secret slipped under the rug of history. She wore no jewelry, no flag pin, only a dark navy trench coat and her indigo head wrap, the same one she wore in the Senate room. She carried nothing but a single canvas bag. At gate 47A, the plane bound for Accra waited, its lights blinking through the glass like some cold mechanical star. But she wasn't ready to board, not yet. There were people here to say goodbye. First came Pastor Mendez, her childhood mentor from West Baltimore. "I remember you running down Lafayette Avenue in your brother's two big boots," he said, voice trembling. "You had fire in your eyes even then. Now you're carrying the ashes of our dreams." She held his hand longer than she meant to. "It's not ashes," she whispered. "It's kindling." Then came Nurse Yvonne, who had organized free clinics with Traoré in the basements of crumbling churches when the city wouldn't give their neighborhood a health center. "Ibra, you changed the game. You taught my kids their lives mattered before anyone else ever did." "I learned it from you," Traoré said, her voice thickening. "All I did was echo." The air grew heavier as more came forward, not to weep, but to remember. They shared moments like confessions, a math lesson she once gave under candlelight when the power went out, a city hall protest where she'd shielded a teen from a baton, a scholarship she'd created in the name of a mother killed by crossfire. No one mentioned the hearing. No one said deportation. The word was too cruel, too sterile for what was happening. This wasn't paperwork. It was exile. Traoré finally turned toward the glass, toward the tarmac. She could see the stars and stripes stitched across the tail of another jet preparing for takeoff. And it hit her not as politics, but as memory. The first time she'd ever seen that flag, she was 5 years old, sitting on her mother's lap at a refugee intake center in Dakar. Her mother pointed and whispered, "That's where we start over." Years later, it was that same flag draped across her friend Marcus's coffin, killed during a mission in Kandahar. And again when she herself stood in uniform, saluting it with 1,000 others under a dust-choked sunrise in Arizona. Now she would leave it behind, not with a salute, but with silence. Behind her, a voice called out, "Do you remember the corner store on Fremont in 23rd? She turned. It was Elijah, one of her former students, now nearly 20. "You told me that if I ever learned to tell my own story, no one could erase me." Her smile was quiet, proud. "Still true." He handed her a small cloth notebook. "Then keep writing yours, so we don't forget ours." She took it. No words, just a nod. Then came the boarding call. "Final call for Flight 332 to Accra. All passengers, please proceed to Gate 47A." She turned once more to look at them all. These people, these places, this impossible dream she had carried through violence, war, and poverty, all standing there like living chapters. And she whispered under her breath, not for them, but for herself, "This isn't goodbye. It's the intermission before Act 2. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, a child in the crowd began singing softly. It was a freedom song from the marches of the 60s. Others joined in off-key but unwavering. The melody rose like a promise that even exile couldn't touch. The jet door closed behind her, and America let go of something it didn't know how to keep. The sun in Ouagadougou was not like the sun in Baltimore. It didn't just shine, it pressed against your skin like a silent challenge. As Ibrahim Traoré stepped off the plane and into the dense, dry air of the Burkina Faso capital, she squinted toward a sky so wide and sharp it felt like it could split open. The welcome was formal, almost ceremonial. Men in pressed uniforms stood waiting on the tarmac alongside a handful of government officials and international journalists who had caught wind of her arrival. A camera crew recorded as she stepped down the stairs, a woman in exile returning to a land that was both hers and foreign. Children waved small flags. A folk singer strummed a kora off to the side. It should have felt like a homecoming. It didn't. The first words someone said to her just off mic were, "Not welcome home, but so you're the one they sent back." The ride through the city was a blur of red, clay roads, street vendors shouting over honking motorbikes, and painted signs faded by decades of sun. Her hotel was modest but secure with iron gates and a courtyard shaded by neem trees. Reporters requested interviews. Local officials sent her flowers. Strangers left notes at the front desk with words like, "Daughter of Africa resistance icon and Black Phoenix." But the silence in her room was thicker than any praise. At night she stared at the ceiling fans spinning slowly above her bed and felt a heaviness that even revolutionaries weren't immune to. This wasn't how she had imagined it. There was no parade. No parade in your soul when you're being celebrated in one land because another had expelled you. She hadn't just been deported from America, she had been dislodged from a life she had built brick by brick. She wandered the markets during the day searching for something familiar. But the rhythms were different, the laughter sharper. The stares lingered too long. She could speak the language more French, a little Dioula, but her accent exposed her. She dressed in local fabrics, but her posture, her gait, the way she responded to strangers all gave her away. To many she was a symbol. To others she was a curiosity. And to a few she was a threat, an educated outsider with Western ideals and just enough defiance to stir things up. One afternoon at a small tea stand, a woman no older than 50 leaned in and said with no malice, "You speak like them. You look like us. But you are neither." It was not an insult. It was an observation. One Traoré had long feared. Later that night, she wrote a single sentence in the cloth notebook Elijah had given her. "Too African for America, too American for Africa." She closed the book and let the pen fall. The room was quiet but not still. The fan creaked overhead, and outside the city pulsed with distant drums and barking dogs. It was a live complex, unconcerned with her internal wars. Traoré had returned to her ancestral soil, but belonging, she realized, was not something the land could give her. It was something she would have to carve out once again with her voice, her hands, and perhaps her grief. It started with a message slipped beneath her hotel room door. No return address, no signature, just a piece of cardstock handwritten in French. They watched the surface, but power always burrows underground. "If you're ready to dig, meet us at the old textile mill. Midnight." She stared at the note for hours, her fingers brushing over the coarse paper like it might dissolve into smoke. The old textile mill was a half-collapsed relic from colonial times just outside the city's industrial district, long abandoned, rumored to be haunted and crawling with police presence after dark. She knew the risks, but instinct overruled fear. At 11:43 p.m., wrapped in a shawl and moving through shadows, she slipped out the back gate of the hotel. When she arrived, the gates were open. Inside the skeletal frame of the factory, the air was thick with dust rust and quiet murmurs. And then she saw them, not ghosts but survivors. Nearly 24 men and women circled a low-burning fire inside the hollowed-out shell of the warehouse. Some wore press badges around their necks. Others had camera bags, notebooks, or only their voices. Journalists, activists, hackers, poets, whistleblowers, veterans of protests that never made the headlines. They called themselves Les Souterrains, the underground. Their mission was simple and dangerous: expose the silent deals that kept Africa bound to its former masters, mineral contracts signed in French development loans that came with puppet strings, military training exchanges, dressed up as diplomacy. They had proof. They had footage. What they lacked was someone with reach, someone the world would listen to. They had been watching her, the Senate hearing, the deportation, the silence that followed. And now they were inviting her in, not just as an icon, but as a weapon. "I'm not interested in being a symbol," Traoré said that first night. "I've had enough of statues and slogans." The group leader, a wiry woman named Aminata with burn scars along her neck, smiled softly. "Good. We're not looking for saints. We're looking for fighters." And so it began. By day, Traoré disappeared into a forgotten corner of the city, a crumbling compound that once served as a colonial training post, now converted into a makeshift school for girls displaced by climate disaster and insurgent violence. Most of the girls had never touched a computer, let alone read a full book. She taught them to read, to write, to argue, to ask questions that made grown men flinch. They called her Tanti Ibra, Auntie Ibra, and hung on her every word. In those sunlit hours surrounded by red dust and laughter, she almost believed she could build a new life from scratch. But night brought other battles. In the back room of a shuttered bookstore near the Grand Marché, she helped set up a makeshift recording studio with nothing but 2 cameras, a ring light, and a repurposed satellite router. The walls were lined with egg crates to muffle sound. They live-streamed anonymously under the code name Echo Woman, unpacking documents leaked from government archives, emails between international executives, aerial photos of strip mines that cut like scars across the Sahel. One expose featured a leaked memo showing that a major Western telecom company was building surveillance infrastructure in exchange for rare earth mineral rights. Another exposed how food aid from foreign donors was tied to genetically modified seeds, patented overseas seeds that couldn't be replanted. The videos exploded across encrypted channels, downloaded, mirrored, shared in back alleys, dorm rooms, and village tea shops. Millions watched. Most never knew her name. She didn't care. She found herself again not through recognition, but through purpose. Each click of the keyboard, each whispered report, each wide-eyed student in a plastic chair brought her closer to something real, not belonging, but anchoring. Rooting herself in the work and the people and the resistance. One evening, while packing up after a live stream that had revealed a covert weapons deal between France and a rebel faction, Aminata turned to her and said, "You've got the soul of a continent in you, but your voice still speaks in American cadences." Traoré chuckled. "Maybe that's why they deported me." Aminata shook her head. "No, that's why they fear you." That night, Traoré walked alone down the narrow corridor, back to her borrowed room. The city buzzed softly in the distance. Somewhere behind her, the voices underground continued their work, steady and unseen. And for the first time since leaving America, she no longer felt like she was drifting. She was tunneling towards something. The invitation came wrapped in polished diplomacy, a digital letter from the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, marked confidential. It had the official seal, the ivory-toned font, and the tight clinical wording that institutions use when trying to sound warm. Traoré was to speak on Panel 4 of the Global Human Rights Summit in Geneva. Her session was titled Displacement Power and the Voice of the Stateless. The irony wasn't lost on her. She stared at the screen for a long time. She had imagined this moment years ago, her voice echoing across one of the world's most hallowed stages, speaking not just for herself, but for the millions whose names never made it into headlines. But now that it had arrived, something felt off, too easy. Still, she accepted. Travel arrangements were made, background checks completed. She chose to route through Ghana, both for safety and symbolism, Kwame Nkrumah's birthplace, the epicenter of Pan-African vision. For 3 weeks, she prepared. She edited every sentence of her speech with surgical care. There would be no wasted words. This was her moment to reframe the narrative not as an exiled activist, but as a global citizen confronting a global structure. But 3 days before departure, the second message came. This one didn't arrive by email. It came through a secure messaging app used only by Les Souterrains. It was short, direct, and sickening. Your travel clearance has been revoked. U.S. and French pressure. They're pulling your summit slot. Official reason, security uncertainty. You've been erased. Traoré's throat tightened. She reread the message 3 times as if some nuance would soften its blow. But it was plain they had shut her down before she ever opened her mouth. For a full hour, she sat silently in the dark room above the bookstore in Accra where she was staying. The humid air hung heavy, and the only sound was the slow rotation of a ceiling fan that might as well have been ticking down the end of her hope. Then she stood. She didn't call anyone. She didn't rage or weep. Instead, she went to the roof. The building was 4 stories high with a flat concrete top surrounded by a low wall. From here, you could see the city stretching in all directions, lights blinking through the smog-muffled horns in the distance, the quiet rhythm of a capital that knew struggle like breath. With help from a Ghanaian hacker named Fosu, barely 20 brilliant and mischievous, she hijacked the summit's live stream broadcast channel. Not the official feed, but the auxiliary media portal designed for press overflow, but left vulnerable. Fosu smiled like a magician revealing a trick. "You've got 15 minutes," he said. "Make them count." At 2 to 12 p.m., Geneva time, just as a diplomat from Belgium began his opening remarks on climate migration, the screens in hundreds of press rooms around the world suddenly flickered, then cut. In his place appeared a woman standing against a wide African skyline with wind in her scarf and fire in her eyes. "My name is Ibrahim Traoré," she said, voice steady. "I was invited to speak to you today. That invitation has been withdrawn not because of a crime, but because of a truth." She spoke for exactly 13 minutes and 46 seconds. She spoke of supply chains soaked in labor blood, of resource extraction dressed as development, of governments that silenced dissent not with bullets, but with visas and bureaucracy. She named countries. She named companies. She named names. "We are not poor," she said. "We are being looted." She spoke of identity, of being told she didn't belong in America, and then being told she was too American to belong in Africa. "If I am too much for your borders," she said, "then your borders are too small for justice." When the feed finally cut, the silence wasn't global, it was electrified. Within minutes, the video began spreading. A Turkish news station picked it up. Then a South African paper translated it. By nightfall, bootleg versions with subtitles were circulating on Telegram, WhatsApp, and Instagram under hashtags like Rooftop Revolt and She Spoke Anyway. At sunrise the next day, a Ghanaian street artist painted her image across the side of a telecom building, surrounded by the words "Banned in Geneva," heard by the world. She never received another invitation from the UN, but she no longer needed one. She had found a higher platform, one that couldn't be revoked. And this time, the world leaned in to listen. They started arriving slowly, at first 1 or 2 a day, folded into international mail envelopes with smudged ink and mismatched stamps. Most had no return address. Some were handwritten, others typed on machines so old the letters wobbled. A few came with small drawings from children or copies of newspaper clippings circled in red. The postmark was always the same: Detroit. Within 2 weeks, her hotel's reception desk was overflowing. By the third, they had to stack the envelopes in crates. At first, Traoré thought it was some glitch, a misdelivery. Then she opened the first one. "My name is Angela. I teach 4th grade in East Detroit. We watched your rooftop speech in class. My kids asked me why they never see women like you on the news. I didn't have an answer. But they've started writing poems about you. Thought you should know." She read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in her notebook. The next was from a sanitation worker who'd seen her Senate hearing on YouTube after his shift. "We work through the winter for people who'll never learn our names. You said something that hit me. I wasn't asking to belong. I was belonging. Ma'am, that's what we all trying to do out here. Just belong somewhere." They kept coming. A retired black steel worker from Pittsburgh who remembered watching MLK speak in '67. A Latina nurse in Chicago who'd been fired after trying to unionize her co-workers. A single mother in Kansas City who wrote that her kids cried when Traoré was deported. They said if someone like her isn't allowed to stay, maybe we won't be either. Some letters were detailed and painful. Others were brief, almost shy, as if the writers weren't sure she'd ever read them. But she did. She read every single one. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived with a shaky handwritten address and no signature. The paper was yellowed. The envelope smelled faintly of old leather. "I served in Vietnam. I wore the flag on my shoulder, not for what we were, but for what we said we were trying to be. I've buried friends for that flag, watched it burn, stitched it back together. And I've lived long enough to see a lot of lies told in its name. But when they forced you out, something cracked in me. If America can't welcome someone like you, then maybe America's broken. Maybe it's waiting for someone like you to fix it." She didn't cry. Not then. But something in her chest shifted quietly, powerfully. All this time she had spoken out from the margins, with the assumption that no one in the heartland was listening, that her voice echoed only in the corners. But these letters told a different story. They hadn't forgotten her. They hadn't looked away. America, in all its fractured contradictions, was still listening. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was ready for something more. That night she stacked the letters in careful piles, by theme, education, labor, justice, memory. They weren't fan mail. They were a movement, one born not in rallies or headlines, but in ink paper, in quiet belief. She whispered to the stacks as if they were people. I haven't given up on you either. Then she opened a blank page in her notebook and wrote one word at the top, return. They called it Operation Passage, a name whispered only between three people: a retired Canadian immigration clerk, a Dominican priest from the Bronx, and Ibrahim Traoré herself. It was never written down. No emails, no texts, just a memory committed to trust and a worn paper map marked with ink dots and bus routes. To the outside world, she was gone. To the officials who had deported her, she was a closed case, a name filed and archived. But in truth, she was already moving through shadows across borders under borrowed names. Her passport now read Fatou Diarra, a Senegalese NGO staffer on temporary assignment in Ottawa. The photo had been subtly altered less. Curl in the hair glasses added skin tone, softened under the grain of grayscale. Enough to pass at first glance, but not if someone looked too long. The day she crossed the U.S.-Canada border, the air was thick with snow. A rented car took her as far as Plattsburgh. From there, she was transferred to the back of a florist's delivery van, where crates of lilies and hydrangeas concealed her body from any casual glance. It was poetic, she thought, smuggled in under the cover of flowers, like a ghost entering her own funeral. By midnight, she was standing in the basement of St. Augustine's Church in Harlem. The priest who greeted her, Father Luis, had once hidden draft resistors during the Iraq War. Now he greeted her like an old comrade returning from exile. His church had long been a refuge for the forgotten addicts, undocumented workers, trans youth, the mentally ill. He gave her a mattress, a lamp, and a narrow desk beneath a cracked stained glass window. "You'll be safe here," he said. "But safety doesn't mean stillness." Traoré nodded. She didn't come back to hide. She came back to ignite. The basement air was cold and smelled faintly of candle wax and rust, but it was hers. She pinned newspaper clippings to the cinder block walls, articles about housing protests, labor strikes, climate lawsuits, and forgotten people doing unforgettable things. Her laptop was shielded by VPNs and proxy chains connected to networks that Les Souterrains had fortified before her departure. At first, only a handful of people knew she had returned: a civil rights attorney in Brooklyn, a union organizer in Minneapolis, a school board candidate in Arizona. Each was sworn to silence, but each also activated their own small networks. Word traveled like a myth passed between breaths. She began holding midnight study circles, sometimes in the basement, sometimes in abandoned storefronts or back rooms of soul food kitchens. Discussions ranged from constitutional law to organizing strategies, from American imperialism to Afro-futurist political theory. Everyone signed in with false names. Everyone brought their own truth. One woman came wearing a wig and sunglasses, whispering, "My husband's in Homeland Security. He voted for the other side, but I believe in you." A sanitation worker arrived after back-to-back shifts, still in uniform, carrying a Tupperware of rice and beans he insisted on sharing. A former congressional aide offered digital access to private legislative drafts, proof that new bills were being fast-tracked to limit third-party candidates from gaining traction in future elections. "They're already planning to bury you again," he warned. Traoré smiled faintly. "Then they'll need a deeper grave." By week 3, encrypted videos began surfacing on social media. Grainy footage of her, cloaked in shadows, speaking to packed rooms. What they deported was not a person. It was a possibility. But possibilities don't carry passports. The clips spread like wildfire, retweeted, subtitled, dissected. Conservative pundits raged. "Traoré is back," one declared on primetime cable, "and she's more dangerous than ever." The government didn't confirm it, not officially. To do so would be to admit they'd lost control. But surveillance increased. Drones buzzed low over Harlem. A plainclothes agent lingered too long outside the church. Father Luis changed the locks twice in 1 week. Still people came. Still she spoke. Hidden beneath a cathedral built by exiles and prayed in by immigrants, Ibrahim Traoré laid the first bricks of a campaign not yet announced. Not with ads, not with money, but with truth whispered in safe rooms, chiseled in silence, and passed hand to hand like contraband hope. She was back. And this time she wasn't alone. She never spoke from a stage. Not yet. No podiums, no microphones, no press releases. Just circles of folding chairs in dusty union halls, candlelit basements of old black churches, the back rooms of taquerias and corner stores where the linoleum peeled and the paint smelled like old summers. They called her Sister I the Echo, or just her, and she always entered through the side door. Word of her appearances spread like rumor, not too fast, never too loud, always one trusted voice at a time. A shop steward would pass a name to a bus driver. A church elder would whisper it to a nursing home cook. "She's coming," they'd say. "She'll speak, but you can't record it. No phones, just ears." The first time she spoke to a union, it was in Newark at a Teamsters local fighting wage theft from a logistics giant. The room was hot and windowless, the walls lined with faded posters from protests long past. Her face was partially veiled not to hide, but to blur just enough to let the ideas shine louder than the person. They want you to believe that change comes with permission, that justice is something you vote on, not something you demand. But history isn't polite, and progress doesn't knock. She spoke of labor as a human inheritance, not a transaction, of dignity that couldn't be measured by hourly pay or healthcare deductibles. When she finished, a mechanic in oil-stained overalls stood and simply said, "I haven't felt this awake in 20 years. At a church on the south side of Chicago, she stood beneath a portrait of Harriet Tubman and spoke about spiritual rebellion. She didn't quote scripture, but the room nodded like she had. Her words wrapped around the congregation like hymns. Freedom begins the moment we stop asking for it. A grandmother clutched her hand afterward and said, "They buried you in ink. But baby, you're growing out of the margins." She spoke to undocumented workers in Houston whose fingertips were rubbed raw from citrus fields, to Haitian nurses in Miami who had lost family in U.S.-funded uprisings, to West Coast truck drivers organizing against AI surveillance in their rigs. Each time she tailored her words not to please but to arm. Behind the scenes, her network grew. Activists cross-trained in digital security. Former public defenders helped shield whistleblowers. Disillusioned interns leaked documents. No one knew exactly how wide her reach had become, but you could feel it. Something was building. Not a riot, not a trend, a tremor. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, Senator J.D. Vance sat on a primetime panel on Fox News, leaning back in his chair with the ease of a man who believed the storm would miss his house entirely. The host, smirking, read from her notes. "There's chatter online suggesting that Ibrahim Traoré, yes, the same one deported for endangering national security, is back on U.S. soil. Some claim she's organizing in underground spaces." "Senator, is there any credibility to this?" J.D. Vance chuckled. "Not forced, not worried." The camera caught the gleam in his teeth. "Let me be clear, Traoré's resurgence is the stuff of fantasy politics. She's a ghost story for the activist left, a bedtime fable told to organizers who still believe in revolutions. The American people aren't interested in chaos wrapped in poetry." He ended with a smirk. "Let her live stream all she wants. Movements don't win in basements. They die there." The segment went viral, but not for the reason he expected. Clips of Vance's remarks were spliced side by side with audio from Traoré's whisper speeches. One showed him scoffing. The next showed her saying, "They will mock you. They will dismiss you. That's how you know you've started to matter." The edits were anonymous, the aesthetic raw. Black and white footage over soul beats quotes in bold white font. They spread across TikTok, Discord, Instagram. Gen Z called it rebel sermon aesthetics. Even more remarkable older voters began sharing them too. Veterans, teachers, civil rights era marchers who hadn't joined a protest in decades. They heard in her voice something that wasn't youthful rebellion, but ageless warning. She never responded to J.D. Vance directly, but one night after a meeting in a cramped Bronx apartment with housing organizers, she was asked how she felt about his ghost story comment. Traoré paused, then smiled softly. "He's right," she said. "I am a ghost, and ghosts don't need doors. We walk through walls." The lights in Centennial Park buzzed like nervous hearts. It had been billed as a unity rally for labor justice and dignity. Over 12,000 people had gathered in downtown Atlanta by sundown teachers, truckers, nurses, veterans, grocery clerks, students with homemade signs and aching feet. Local organizers spoke first. Poets followed. A gospel choir lifted the dusk into something close to sacred. But the crowd knew they hadn't come for music. They had come because of a rumor, the same one that had traveled like static through factory floors, Break room whispers, WhatsApp threads, and hand-scrawled flyers taped to barbershop doors. She might appear. The stage was modest, no branded banners, no political logos, just a black curtain backdrop and a microphone on a worn wooden stand. Security, minimal but watchful, patrolled the edges of the field, though no one expected chaos. What they expected, if anything, was confirmation, a glimpse, a sign. At exactly 9:03 p.m., the lights dimmed. The MC, a community elder in a brown corduroy blazer, approached the mic. He cleared his throat slowly, letting the crowd settle into silence. Then, with a quiet reverence, he said, "You've heard the whispers? Now hear the voice." A single spotlight ignited, casting a narrow beam at the center of the stage, and she walked into it. No scarf over her face this time. No shadows. Just Ibrahim Traoré, fully visible spine, straight hands, calm. The crowd didn't erupt. They inhaled as one, a collective breath held between fear and awe. Cameras rose like waves. The live stream feed surged. Within minutes, hashtags were trending globally. Hashtag she's back. Traoré returns. Not a fantasy. She stepped to the microphone. No notes, no teleprompter. Just a pause long enough to stretch time, and then a voice sharp and steady enough to break it. Some of you have been told I disappeared. Some of you were told I was silenced. Others were told I was dangerous. And they were right about one thing. A beat. I am dangerous, but not to this country, to the lies that have made this country forget itself. The crowd stirred. Some people wept, not from sadness, but recognition. I am not back for revenge. I am back because this is my country too. I am the product of your public schools, your forgotten neighborhoods, your broken promises, and your relentless hope. I was deported for telling the truth, but the truth found its way home. Voices shouted her name. People climbed onto shoulders just to see her face. You've been told to wait your turn. I say turn around and face them now. You've been told change comes slowly. I say the clock is ours to reset. You've been told that someone like me could never lead you. I say look again. Then she stepped back. Just one step, and in that silence something ancient moved. No marching band, no dramatic exit, just her presence unwavering. As she walked off stage, a child ran to the front of the crowd holding up a sign drawn in crayon. It read, "Welcome home, Traoré." And from that moment on, no one, not even the ones who tried to erase her, could deny it. She was home. The podium was borrowed. The flag behind it had frayed edges. The stage creaked slightly under her heels. There were no fireworks, no brass band, no teleprompter synced to a sleek campaign machine. But that morning on a wind-brushed lawn outside a shuttered community college in Savannah, Georgia, Ibrahim Traoré announced her candidacy for President of the United States. It wasn't a spectacle, it was a statement. Just behind her, taped to the front of the podium with uneven blue painter's tape, was a hand-painted sign that read in thick black brush strokes, "Independent, unbought, undeportable." She wore a simple black blazer, a faded lapel pin of the American flag given to her by a veteran months ago, and a calm so practiced it felt ancestral. Cameras clicked and shuffled. Local press stood side by side with national outlets, most of them waiting for something they could turn into a joke. I know what they'll say, she began. They'll say this is theater, that it's symbolic, that it's emotional, not electable. But tell me, what has America gained from electing those without emotion, without memory? A quiet ripple moved through the crowd. About 400 people had gathered in person. Young organizers in hoodies, retirees in lawn chairs, mothers bouncing toddlers on their hips. A truck driver from Ohio held a cardboard sign, "If not her, who?" They'll say I don't have a party, but I have something better. I have people. I have welders, nurses, janitors, veterans, teachers, prisoners, dreamers. I have no PACs, but I have purpose. And that is enough. Her voice rose, not theatrical, but defiant, steady. It didn't ask for permission. Let them ask where my donors are. Let them ask how I'll get on the ballots. Let them ask how a woman without a country can run a country. I will answer all their questions in November, because I am not here to play their game. I am here to end it. The applause wasn't deafening, but it was authentic, and more importantly, it was amplified. By nightfall, the announcement clip had been reposted nearly 400,000 times across social media. Celebrities quietly retweeted it. Former staffers from progressive campaigns whispered into microphones on podcasts, "You should be paying attention to this." Still, the mainstream media responded exactly as expected. That evening on a major cable news panel, the headline banner read, "Traoré declares presidency, performance art or political suicide." One host chuckled into the camera. "So a stateless activist who doesn't belong to any political party is running for the most powerful office in the world. I guess she's hoping ballots will be counted on vibes." Laughter around the table. J.D. Vance, when asked by a reporter outside the Capitol, smirked and said, "It's adorable. But presidential campaigns aren't TikTok movements." Pundits dismissed her as a footnote, an internet moment, a long shot without a war chest or a super PAC. But within 48 hours, the polls began to shift. Not in the traditional way, not in swing states or among focus groups curated by strategists, but in the margins, the overlooked counties, the places with more boarded-up schools than Starbucks. A local radio station in Mississippi reported a 9-point jump in her name recognition among Black veterans. A farmers' co-op in Nebraska began printing her name on their seed bags. "So with her" became a minor slogan. A YouGov survey found that among voters under 35, her favorability rating shot from 12% to 41% in 2 days. More alarming to the establishment, an internal Democratic memo leaked by a junior staffer read, "She's not pulling votes from the right. She's pulling them from people we thought had stopped voting." Meanwhile, Traoré didn't gloat. She didn't clap back at critics. She returned to the south side of Chicago and helped stock a food pantry. She met with striking Amazon workers in Kentucky. She live-streamed from a public library in Oakland about housing as a human right. She didn't chase headlines. She chased needs. And quietly across the nation, people began to ask each other, not with sarcasm, but with possibility, what if she actually wins? They didn't go after her first. They went after the structure. 2 weeks after Traoré's announcement in a quiet late-night session on the Senate floor, J.D. Vance introduced a new piece of legislation, the Integrity of Electoral Citizenship Act, quietly referred to by insiders as the Integrity Act. On paper, it was a benign document wrapped in patriotism, an act to reaffirm the constitutional eligibility of presidential candidates and protect against threats to national coherence. The bill was barely 12 pages long, but buried in its polite legalese was Clause 9b, which required that all presidential candidates must be citizens born of legal permanence, having not been subject to any deportation action or foreign intelligence watch list within the last 20 years. It passed the first vote by morning. Cable news barely covered it. Most of the language was too dull to spark headlines, and the public was distracted by manufactured scandals on both sides of the political aisle. But Traoré's team understood the move for what it was: not a law, but a guillotine disguised as paperwork. "This is a scalpel cut to the throat," her campaign advisor, Lena Tsao, said flatly, reading the bill from a folding chair in a basement in Cleveland. "They're coming, and they'll do it wearing suits." 2 days later, they stopped wearing suits. The FBI raid came just after 5 a.m. in a quiet neighborhood in Baltimore, where one of Traoré's organizing hubs operated out of a small rented duplex. It wasn't a headquarters. There was no official campaign sign, no visible leadership, just 3 college students, a retired nurse, and a union rep who had been assembling outreach materials and running digital strategy from a cluttered living room. The agents came in unannounced, dressed in black windbreakers, moving fast. Laptops were seized, phones confiscated, notes, USB drives, donation ledgers, all packed into evidence boxes marked national interest. One organizer, Malik, was detained for 12 hours. He wasn't charged. But when he was released, he said only one thing: they weren't looking for evidence. They were looking for fear. That same morning, Traoré received word of the raid from a contact inside the Justice Department. She was in Oakland preparing to meet with housing activists. Her face didn't change, but her knuckles tightened around the coffee cup in her hands. "It's beginning," she whispered. Later that day, she addressed the press not from a podium, but from the steps of a public courthouse with no advance notice. Dozens of supporters flanked her, most wearing plain clothes. No chants, no signs, just presence. "They want to make an example out of us," she said. "So let us be an example, not of fear, but of clarity. Let every citizen in this country ask themselves why a law was written in the dead of night just to stop one woman from running? Ask what kind of democracy fears its own people so much it would rather break the rules than listen. She spoke quietly, deliberately, not to provoke, to endure. That night, J.D. Vance appeared on the Senate floor again. "Let me remind this body," he said, "that we are not the enemies of democracy. We are its defenders. We do not silence voices, we ensure only legitimate ones are amplified." The C-SPAN cameras caught his smile. But outside the chamber, in cities across the country, people were beginning to read Clause 9b for themselves. And when they did, the phone lines at local offices lit up not with rage, but with one repeated question: "What exactly are you so afraid she'll say they weren't organized?" Not at first. No central planning, no national call to action, no glossy campaign posters or coordinated hashtags. But after the raid in Baltimore and the Integrity Act's quiet passage through the Senate, something in the country cracked open, and into that crack poured bodies. In Portland, a group of nurses staged a silent sit-in outside City Hall, holding printed copies of Clause 9b taped over their mouths. In Detroit, auto workers walked off the assembly line mid-shift and gathered outside in the freezing wind with handwritten signs, "Democracy doesn't deport candidates." In New Orleans, a brass band led a procession down Canal Street, the horns wailing behind chants of "Let her run." In Phoenix, high school students locked arms around the state capitol steps and refused to move until they were arrested or heard. In Philadelphia, a retired Vietnam veteran named George Thacker stood at the corner of 15th and Market, his hands trembling slightly as he held a sign that simply read, "I fought for her right to run." Someone took a photo. It went viral. By nightfall, that image had become an emblem. Within 48 hours, it was printed on T-shirts, painted on murals, projected onto courthouse walls. George's face became a monument, not to protest but to memory, to sacrifice, to the belief that freedom didn't come with conditions. Cable news anchors tried to pivot. Some still framed the movement as misguided passion. Others began backpedaling their voices carefully, recalibrating to accommodate the tidal shift of public opinion. "She's clearly struck a nerve," one host muttered, eyes down at his cue card. J.D. Vance doubled down. "These are not demonstrations," he declared in a press conference. "They're coordinated disruptions designed to destabilize confidence in our institutions." But no one had coordinated anything. The streets had simply spoken. In Seattle, a man in a wheelchair painted the words, "Ibrahim belongs," on his tires and rolled through Pike Place, leaving inked trails behind him, like a signature. In Atlanta, a group of teachers held flash classes in open parks, reading the Constitution aloud to strangers. In Topeka, a Republican grandmother left church and walked straight to the town square to light a candle, whispering to the local news, "I don't know if I'd vote for her, but I'll be damned if I let them silence her." And in Harlem, Father Luis opened the church basement to a wave of new volunteers. "You'd think she were already president," he said, smiling through tears. "Or maybe something more useful, a mirror." Traoré herself did not appear on the streets that week. She watched from rooftops, back rooms, live streams projected against broken walls. She did not need to be everywhere. She was everywhere. The voice they tried to exile had become a chorus carried by the very people the system had forgotten. And as the marches continued from small towns to state capitals, a question echoed louder than sirens or slogans. If this is still a democracy, why are we fighting to let someone run? The motel room smelled like bleach and old dreams. A low buzz came from the flickering light above the mirror, casting her reflection in dull amber. The bedspread was scratchy, printed with faded sunflowers, and the television remote only worked if you pressed down hard on the numbers. This wasn't the kind of place candidates stayed before a presidential debate. But then again, Ibrahim Traoré wasn't that kind of candidate. The walls were thin. Through them, she could hear a couple arguing 2 doors down. Somewhere in the parking lot, an engine turned over and coughed into life. It was almost midnight. She sat at the edge of the bed, still wearing her black boots, her coat folded neatly beside her. On the nightstand sat her phone, cracked across one corner, glowing dimly with a single video message, an old file rediscovered by her team earlier that week, while combing through archived footage for campaign content. It was from her father. Recorded on a grainy camcorder in 2003, back when he still believed video might preserve something the world couldn't touch. He sat in a plastic lawn chair wearing his work uniform from the city sanitation department. Behind him, a child's bike lay in the grass. His voice, quiet but clear, cut through the static. Ibra, if you're seeing this, you're already where I hoped you'd be, even if the world didn't make it easy. I don't know what they'll call you, troublemaker, threat, outsider. But you remember one thing. He leaned forward, eyes tired but shining. This country doesn't belong to the loudest men in the room. It belongs to the ones who stay standing when the shouting's done. The video ended with his soft chuckle, followed by silence. She didn't cry. She had done that already years ago in another country before a different storm. But her shoulders shifted slightly as if the weight of his memory had landed exactly where it needed to be. At 12:17 a.m., her campaign manager texted, "Security confirmed. Secret Service denied access. Non-party candidates not entitled to federal protection. Debate hall will be on high alert. Are you sure you want to go in alone?" She replied with 2 words, "I'm ready." The next evening, the debate venue glowed under sharp spotlights and drone cameras. Outside, crowds gathered behind barricades, some chanting her name, others holding signs denouncing her as un-American. Police stood shoulder to shoulder in riot gear, flanked by federal agents. The air smelled of ozone and tension. Inside the green room, the other candidates waited with entourages, makeup artists, policy advisors, pollsters with earpieces. J.D. Vance adjusted his cufflinks and laughed quietly at something his chief strategist whispered. Traoré walked in alone. No stylist, no handler, no papers in her hand. She wore a navy blue suit jacket over a black blouse. Her scarf was deep crimson, woven with gold thread, a quiet nod to her mother's village colors. Her shoes were scuffed from travel. Her lips were bare. An aide offered to walk her to the stage entrance. She declined. As she moved through the narrow corridor toward the debate hall, a sound rose not from the crowd outside, not from the media pit, but from within. A quiet rhythm, her heartbeat steady, familiar. This was not fear. This was memory sharpening into purpose. She passed a hallway mirror and paused just long enough to look herself in the eye. Not for reassurance, but to say without speaking, "You belong here," whether they say it or not. Then she turned the corner and stepped through the curtains toward the podium set furthest stage left. No party logo, no color code. Just a nameplate that read, Traoré, Independent. And in that moment, the noise of the world, the headlines, the mockery, the threats, the laws, written in backrooms, faded. All that remained was the silence before a voice changes everything. The debate opened like all the others, stiff introductions, a moderator with practiced neutrality, and candidates reciting rehearsed lines crafted by teams of consultants. But when they reached the question of national unity in an age of division, the temperature shifted. J.D. Vance struck first. He smiled for the camera, leaned slightly toward his mic, and began with calculated warmth. Now let me be clear. I respect Ms. Traoré's passion. I really do. But at some point, we have to stop mistaking poetic speeches for policy. And while slogans might move hearts, they don't run countries. The audience tensed. He wasn't finished. This is a serious nation, and we need serious leadership, not stories about hardship, not victimhood narratives, not someone who was once removed from this country for good reason. The words hung in the air like ash. Technically, he hadn't broken decorum, but everyone knew what he meant. Traoré didn't blink. She leaned forward slowly. No notes, no script, just a quiet inhale, then a voice that didn't rise but cut. "Let me also be clear," she said. "I was deported for telling the truth about corruption. I was silenced for naming the people profiting from pain. I was erased because I refused to shrink. And now I'm here not as a symbol but as a citizen, one who paid her dues with blood service and silence." The moderator tried to pivot, but J.D. Vance pressed on. "But were you ever truly one of us? You were born abroad. You hold no party membership. You call for the dismantling of institutions that have kept this country stable for generations." He smiled again, colder this time. "Why should the American people trust someone who only just got her voice back?" That's when the thunder came, not literal, but emotional. Traoré straightened, placed both hands on the podium, and spoke in a tone no prep room could have taught her. "Because I've lived the version of America most politicians only reference in campaign ads. I've stood in food pantry lines after serving in uniform. I've watched children dodge bullets on their walk to school. I've buried friends who couldn't afford insulin. I didn't need a think tank to explain suffering. I survived it. She paused just enough. And as for trust, trust the one who has nothing to lose from the truth. Trust the one who walked back into this country without a party to protect her. Trust the one who didn't come here to climb, but to lift. A few gasps, some muffled applause, quickly silenced by the moderator. Then came the economic question. J.D. Vance referenced GDP trends, trade deficits, and corporate tax brackets. Traoré talked about the janitor in Cleveland who worked 3 jobs and still lived in his car. The warehouse worker in Fresno who lost her pregnancy lifting 30-pound packages. The teacher in Arkansas who hadn't had a raise in 10 years and paid for textbooks with grocery money. We talk about markets as if they breathe, but people are not numbers, and dignity is not negotiable. By the time foreign policy came up, the moderator was visibly rattled. J.D. Vance emphasized strength, deterrence, patriotism. Traoré talked about drone strikes that missed their targets and leveled homes full of children. About arms deals dressed up as diplomacy. About how patriotism meant telling your country the truth even when it didn't want to hear it. My father picked up American garbage for 30 years. He said it taught him more about this country than any textbook ever could. Because when you know what a nation throws away, you know who it really is. The audience was silent, but not numb. They were listening, really listening. As the closing remarks approached, Vance went back to his playbook. Leadership requires clarity, he said. And Ms. Traoré, she's a storyteller, not a statesman. She looked at him not with anger, but something deeper. This country was founded by storytellers, and the most dangerous thing you can do to a story is try to silence the one telling it. Then she looked into the camera, past the lights, past the spin rooms, and the headlines waiting to be written. I am not asking for your pity. I am asking for your power. Because power in a democracy was never meant to be inherited. It was meant to be reclaimed. And with that, the debate ended. But the storm it stirred was just beginning. The debate was nearly over. Closing remarks had been delivered. The moderators were already glancing at their watches, half thinking about post-show analysis sponsors' headlines. But then in what seemed like an afterthought or maybe a divine accident, the senior moderator leaned toward his microphone and said, "One final question, if we may. And we'll ask all candidates to answer with sincerity, not strategy." A brief pause. A flicker of uncertainty crossed a few faces on stage. What does America mean to you? A simple question, the kind they usually save for town halls or glossy campaign ads. But in that moment, beneath the hot lights and the weight of everything unsaid, it felt impossibly large. The candidates went first, one by one. A libertarian cited freedom. A senator invoked tradition and sacrifice. J.D. Vance offered a polished line about American exceptionalism, referencing the Founding Fathers, in a nation ordained by courage. Polite applause followed each answer. Then the moderator turned to the final podium, the only one not flanked by a party. Traoré stood still, her hands at her sides, her gaze steady. And for a long moment she said nothing. Not because she was calculating, but because she was remembering. And then softly, barely above a whisper, she began. America, she said, is a country that told my mother she wasn't welcome, and then asked her to clean its hospitals. A country that gave my father a job but never called him a neighbor. A country that handed me a flag when I wore its uniform, and then a deportation order when I used my voice. Her tone wasn't bitter. It was worn, like an old photograph passed between hands. America is the sound of 2 children whispering under bedsheets while gunshots echo down the block. It's the cafeteria worker giving away her lunch to a student who forgot their card again. It's a mechanic driving home after a double shift who still believes voting makes a difference. It's contradiction. It's beauty. It's exhaustion. It's poetry in a borrowed tongue. The studio was silent. Even J.D. Vance had stopped shifting. She looked directly into the camera, then not with anger, but with something more dangerous. Love sharpened by clarity. What does America mean to me? A beat. It means never giving up on a home. That gave up on you. The words didn't explode. They sank deep, deliberate into every viewer who had ever felt forgotten, betrayed, erased, or halfway home. Somewhere in Kansas, a teacher watching from her phone on break covered her mouth and whispered, "That's it." In Los Angeles, a veteran paused mid-sip of his beer and rewound the live stream. In Harlem, in the church basement where it had all begun, Father Luis stood alone before a flickering television screen and whispered, "Now they know." The moment lasted no more than 20 seconds, but within 2 hours it had tens of millions of views. Clips of her answer spread faster than campaign ads ever could. Celebrities posted it, strangers captioned it. A jazz musician turned the quote into a trumpet solo. Street artists spray-painted the words on highway underpasses. Teachers printed it on classroom walls. Never giving up on a home that gave up on you. Some said it was the best political answer they'd ever heard. Others said it wasn't political at all. It was personal. Too personal to ignore. And as the media scrambled to analyze the Traoré moment and pundits debated whether it would shift the polls or simply warm the hearts of idealists, something far less measurable was happening. People weren't just watching her anymore. They were seeing themselves in her. And that was something no debate commission could regulate. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow, but the mood inside was anything but. It was past 9 p.m. Eastern when the first projections came in. A television mounted in the corner of the campaign's modest Atlanta headquarters flickered with charts, counties, and color-coded disappointment. The exit polls weren't just grim, they were definitive. Florida 3%, Ohio 2.4%, Arizona 1.8%, Wisconsin 1.1%. Too low to compete, too high to ignore. The team huddled around tables strewn with empty coffee cups, power bar wrappers, and campaign buttons no longer clipped to anyone's chest. Laptops were open but untouched. The chatter had died. The whiteboard with the possible swing states list now looked like a cruel joke. Someone muted the TV. No one said anything. In the far corner, Lena Tsao, the campaign manager, who had once sworn they'd flip 3 states minimum, sat with her forehead pressed to her clipboard shoulders, shaking silently. "I think we broke something," a volunteer whispered. "No," replied someone else. "I think we were trying to fix something that didn't want to be fixed." Traoré wasn't in the room. She left quietly before the first results were announced. She didn't say where she was going. She just removed her campaign pin, handed it to a young organizer named Marisol, and said, "Keep this. It means more when you carry it forward." By the time the networks called the election, predictably for the incumbent, Traoré had vanished. She ended up in a women's shelter in Newark, not because she had no place to go, but because she needed to remember why she ever ran in the first place. The building was old brick-faced, tucked between a shuttered corner store and a junkyard. The sign on the door was barely legible: St. Mercy's Outreach and Emergency Housing. Inside, the air smelled like oatmeal and bleach, and the silence was filled with the weight of invisible wounds. They let her in without fanfare. The woman at the desk had seen her name before, but didn't say anything. She just handed her a folded towel and said, "You'll be safe here." Her bed was a twin mattress, tucked behind a curtain, surrounded by 5 others. Most of the women were asleep. One hummed quietly in the dark. For the next 48 hours, she stayed there. No calls, no press, no entourage. She helped clean dishes in the communal kitchen. She sat in on a trauma circle, listening, not speaking, as women shared stories of fists, silence, flight. One woman said, "The hardest part isn't leaving. It's believing someone will catch you when you do." Traoré closed her eyes. That night, she sat alone in the tiny courtyard behind the building, staring up at the New Jersey sky, which held no stars, only the soft glow of street lamps filtered through smog. And she finally let it hit her. The grief, the anger, the weight of trying to hold a nation in her hands and watching it slip through her fingers. She had asked a country to believe in something new, and it had answered with cynicism, fear, and the cold logic of numbers. "You knew this could happen," she whispered to herself, but knowing didn't make it hurt less. Still, she wasn't broken, just quiet, just tired. The door creaked behind her. A girl, maybe 10, peeked out and handed her a paper cup of warm milk. No words, just a gesture. She took it with both hands, nodded, and whispered, "Thank you." And in that small kindness, in that shelter built for the discarded, a tiny ember stirred again. Faint, flickering, but not out. It began as a whisper on a back-channel forum, a leaked PDF file dumped anonymously into a private group of election observers. At first, it looked like nothing more than a blurry internal memo. Then came screenshots, then full documents, then names, and suddenly the whole country stopped breathing. A whistleblower from inside J.D. Vance's campaign had released a damning archive, 312 pages of internal communication data sheets and strategy memos, explicitly detailing efforts to suppress voter access in areas with high support for independent and third-party candidates, particularly those aligned with Traoré. The documents read like war plans: identify precincts with known echo votes, disrupt polling flow through procedural slowdown, exploit felony confusion in urban areas, flood mailboxes with misinformation on eligibility, deploy targeted social ads hinting at foreign financing, encourage abstention through cynicism. One note was especially chilling. Our goal is not to beat her ideas, it's to convince people their votes won't count. The whistleblower, later identified as a young data analyst named Marcus Lee, had resigned 2 weeks before the election. No one noticed, but he'd kept copies, and now his conscience, along with a backup drive, had gone public. Within 24 hours, the story detonated. Major news outlets confirmed the authenticity of the files. Election law experts began appearing on every screen, highlighting the blatant manipulation tactics. Civil liberties groups filed immediate injunctions. Former federal judges began tweeting terms like constitutional emergency and systemic breach of democratic process. But it wasn't the experts who lit the match. It was the people. From coast to coast, the protests reignited, this time, not in pockets, but in waves. Tens of thousands gathered in Philadelphia, marching silently in rows of 312, one row for every page of evidence. In Denver, activists projected lines from the leaked memos onto the walls of government buildings. In Baton Rouge, a black church choir marched through the streets in robes singing a freedom song rewritten with Traoré's name woven into every verse. Even the undecided began to stir. People who hadn't voted at all stood up at town halls and said, "I didn't vote for her, but now I wish I had. And I want my voice counted." Cable networks scrambled to keep up. News crawlers at the bottom of every screen read, "Sabotage allegations, shake election legitimacy." J.D. Vance appeared the following evening in a hastily arranged press conference. His jaw was tight, his voice clipped. "These documents are taken out of context. The opposition is desperate. These are routine campaign strategies, no different from what either party uses. The election was secure, the results stand. But the country had already passed the point of trusting televised denials. By week's end, 3 states, Georgia, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, had formally requested an independent review of suppressed votes. Petitions flooded local courts. Emergency filings were delivered to federal judges by midnight couriers. And finally, the Supreme Court intervened. In a rare 5-4 emergency ruling, the court announced it would review the validity of several state certifications under suspicion of voter suppression and targeted disinformation. Justice Calder, in a concurring opinion, wrote, "The integrity of democracy does not rest on who wins, but on whether every citizen believes they could have." Traoré watched the announcement from the same women's shelter where she had hidden just days before. She didn't cheer, she didn't cry. She simply folded the newspaper, exhaled, and whispered, "The truth has longer legs than silence." Outside the shelter, someone had spray-painted on the wall in neat cursive, "Recount the future." When the final ruling came down from the Supreme Court, the vote counts didn't change much. 3 states were ordered to recertify their tallies. In 2 of them, Traoré gained just enough to flip the map, not enough to win the presidency, but enough to redraw history. She ended with 91 electoral votes. No independent candidate had reached that number in over a century. She didn't take a victory lap. No press tour. No late-night talk shows. When asked by a reporter how she felt, she simply said, "We didn't win the seat, but we've shaken the table it sits at." And indeed, the table shook. In the weeks that followed, a coalition of newly elected independents and progressive down-ballot candidates announced their intent to form a new congressional bloc. Not a party yet, but a movement formalized into legislative action. They called themselves the People's Table. Their goal: to disrupt deadlocks, resist corporate capture, and realign democracy around dignity, transparency, and repair. They cited Traoré as their moral compass. "She showed us that visibility isn't power," said one freshman congresswoman from Michigan. "Accountability is." Inside, the halls of government power brokers scrambled. Old alliances began to fracture. Moderate Democrats debated joining the coalition to avoid total obsolescence. The Speaker of the House, under mounting pressure, agreed to meet with coalition leaders to negotiate shared committee control. But amid the political realignments, one headline turned heads nationwide. Traoré tapped for cabinet role Secretary of Human Rights. It was a new post, one not previously part of any U.S. administration, created as part of a transparency reform bill hastily passed in response to nationwide protest. It would oversee civil liberties, voting access, immigrant protections, and institutional discrimination across federal agencies. The president, bruised by the legitimacy crisis and seeking to calm public outrage, offered the position to Traoré personally. It was not a concession. It was a recognition. The offer came in the form of a simple envelope delivered by hand to her small office in Newark. No ribbon, no ceremony, just a letter that read, "The country cannot heal without first listening to the ones it once tried to silence." She took 24 hours to consider it, not because she hesitated, but because she understood the cost. The role would not be symbolic. It would require long days, hard compromises, and likely more enemies than allies. It would not be a crown, but it would be a lever. And so she accepted. At the press conference, she did not wear white. She did not stand behind bulletproof glass. She did not deliver sound bites. She stood before a plain wooden podium in front of a brick community center, surrounded not by senators, but by nurses, teachers, janitors, farm workers, and formerly incarcerated organizers who had walked with her from the beginning. "I did not come here to serve power," she said. "I came here to serve people. If this seat helps me do that, then I will sit in it. But know this, it belongs to all of us." She never became president, but she became something the office had long forgotten how to be: a moral compass, a force, a threshold. And in the cracks of a broken system, her name was no longer just spoken, it was trusted. Inauguration Day arrived beneath a bright, windswept sky. The Capitol steps gleamed with ceremony, but something unusual caught the cameras: a single chair placed to the far left of the stage, draped in vibrant kente cloth. It was unmarked, unspoken, but everyone watching knew what it meant. She wasn't there not by absence, but by decision. Traoré had declined to attend the inauguration of the man she'd nearly unseated. "This day isn't mine," she had said quietly. "It belongs to the people who believed anyway." At the National Mall, where tens of thousands had gathered, the official program paused for one unscheduled moment. A girl no more than 10 in braids and a hand-sewn coat stepped up to the microphone, holding a piece of paper with careful handwriting. "My name is Layla," she said, "and this is what Miss Traoré said once: America means never giving up on a home that gave up on you. I believe that means it can still change." The crowd fell silent. Then applause rose, not thunderous, but real. Raw, healing. That day she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence was already there, stitched into fabric, carried in memory, echoed in a child's voice. She took the office quietly. No swearing-in gala, no red carpets, just a working session inside a downtown community center, surrounded by survivors, social workers, and elders who had marched beside her from the beginning. As Secretary of Human Rights, she made it clear from day one: policy without people is paper. She launched a national initiative to end cash bail, created trauma-informed rehabilitation programs in lieu of prison for nonviolent offenders, restored healthcare access to undocumented workers, and expanded maternal clinics in neglected rural towns. She refused corporate donations. Her office ran out of old union halls, barbershops, public libraries. Every Monday, she hosted live-stream town halls, not for optics, but for questions. She answered everyone. When a 78-year-old veteran asked how she planned to protect voting rights for the disabled, she wrote back personally and sent staff to redesign polling access in his district. Donations poured in, but not from the rich. Retired bus drivers sent $12 checks. Nurses sent handwritten notes with $20 bills folded inside. A grandmother from West Virginia wrote, "We didn't march in the 60s so our grandchildren would be forgotten." She remembers. That's why we give. The media dubbed it the People's Cabinet. She just called it doing the work. On the final day of her term, she didn't choose a podium. She chose the Lincoln Memorial. Standing beneath the giant seated figure where other voices had once echoed through history, She delivered her final public address, live streamed to over 90 million people across the world. She wore no title badge, no staff behind her, only her words. They called me too radical, too soft, too dangerous. They called me outsider, dreamer, ghost. But the truth is, I've only ever been one thing. She paused. My name is Traoré, and I stood here for the invisible, for the tired, for the counted out, for the ones America tried to forget but never quite could. She didn't promise change. She reflected on it. You don't need to win the presidency to lead. You don't need a title to matter. You just need to remember that silence is a choice. A gust of wind moved through the memorial. Flags fluttered behind her. She looked straight into the lens for the final line. They may never call me president, but they'll never forget why I stood. And with that, she turned. No music played. But across the country, in classrooms, prisons, farms, shelters, and homes, people stood up. Because she had. Sometimes the most powerful voices don't come from positions of power, but from those who've been pushed out, silenced, or told they don't belong. Ibrahim Traoré's story reminds us that truth spoken with courage can ripple further than any title or office. It's not about winning a debate, it's about standing for something when it would be easier to walk away. What would you do if the world told you to be quiet, but your conscience told you to speak? If this story touched, you don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.